Hello everyone, this is your old history professor once again, and this is lecture number 22, The Fall of Rome for History 231, Ancient Mediterranean World. Of course, we're going to have Rome falling. It's going to be very exciting indeed. So, let us press onward here. We've been talking about Constantine, and of course Constantine gets 2 stars. He shares that with Theodosius, who we'll get to in a moment. Constantine is a very big deal, because he makes Christianity legal in the Roman Empire, and then he starts favoring it, which means he's pumping money into it, lots and lots of money. And what this does, of course, is it radically alters the nature and the face of Christianity. Christianity prior to Constantine was an underground, illegal religion. People were literally hiding in sewers to worship and that sort of thing. They were being fed to lions and thrown into the arenas, and it was just very, very bad. And the Christians, of course, were able to do well in spite of this, and perhaps even because of it. But nonetheless, by the time of Constantine, Christianity has been growing, and Constantine has said to himself, I need to hold this empire together. He's very aware that the Roman Empire has got lots and lots of problems, and he says to himself, gee, maybe this can help. And that does seem to be his goal. That does seem to be his intention, is to come up with some unifying force that will pull the empire together. And of course, one of the things that can pull groups of people together are cultural things. Political things only work so well if you're trying to hold large groups of people together, because eventually people start fighting with each other over politics. And that's something we see in pretty much every country, including our own. But cultural things can have a much wider spread, and cultural things include things like religions. And so Constantine seems to have thought to himself, this might just work. And of course, he's taking an idea from our dear friend Eusebius, and he's saying, hey, maybe this will work. So he's going to try and make Christianity not merely legal, but favored. And that is going to be a real game changer. All but one of the Roman emperors after Constantine were Christians, and the one guy who's not is a fellow named Julian the Apostate. Now, Julian was from Constantine's family, he's a descendant of Constantine, and of course he is raised as a Christian as a result, but he is an interesting sort of fellow. And what he's realizing is that this is not working out quite as they had thought. This is a bigger problem than we thought. For one thing, not everyone suddenly became Christian. It's not like people woke up one morning and said, okay, gosh, the emperor wants to be us to be Christians, so let's all just become Christians. People do not change religions just like that. Religion is a very personal thing, it's also a cultural thing, and it doesn't just change overnight. So, what does this mean? This means that the Roman Empire is still going to have divisions, even though Christianity is now favored. All right, so this is going to be a big problem. So, for example, the army. Now, the army is always a big deal. An army is an important part of any culture, and of course, for the Romans, it was a very important part of the culture. They're not really into Christianity at all. They're into Mithra. They're into a whole different sort of god. So you don't tend to see this stuff. Pagans are still around. Pagans are still active, and some pagans are not too keen on this new rival in Christianity either here. And so that is going to be an interesting kind of problem that they're going to have to deal with. But Christianity is coming up, because of course when you get the emperor involved and on board, it's going to make a big difference. And suddenly we start seeing pagan temples literally being stripped, robbed, in order to finance big churches and this kind of thing. And that is, of course, going to cause some problems. It's going to cause some tensions in society. But something to keep in mind, and I've mentioned this before, is that the pagan gods had not really been doing much for people. That's the problem, all right? The pagan gods were distant. Jupiter is off wherever he is, with his lightning bolts, and it's like, he's not really in my life. He's not part of my life. So maybe his temple's got a lot of money, and maybe some people like to go to his temple, but a lot of people were like, yeah, it's just not my thing. Not really my thing. So they were kind of open to something new. So it isn't just a political move. There is a social movement going on as well. Paganism is increasingly finding itself obsolete, and that is becoming a big problem. Now, some people have argued that the church started stealing the best and the brightest, and this is something that we do see. Movements that can get a lot of smart people on board tend to do really well. So the idea was that, hey, if the church starts bringing in all the smart people, then all the smart people aren't going to be anywhere else. And there are some people who have argued for this, all right? There are some people who have argued for this. Now, there are some historians, Gibbon, for example, who've said, oh my gosh, that was it. Christianity wrecked the Roman world. Oh my gosh, suddenly we have all these superstitious Christians running around, and they just made a mess of everything. That's probably not fair. Christianity is intellectually a very dynamic religion. It always has been, and there's no reason to believe that the Christians were any less intellectual than any of the pagans around them. They may have been different in their intellectualism, and it is true that once Christianity becomes incredibly political, it is going to start shutting down a lot of intellectual activity. But the simple fact is, there's nothing about Christianity that is anti-intellectual. Quite the contrary. In fact, Christianity can be an extremely intellectual religion. But it's not going as smoothly as Constantine apparently had hoped. Now, Constantine dies. He's out of the picture by this time, and his family, his descendants, are squabbling over the empire. They're squabbling over who's going to be the next emperor. And this gets messy. You start having almost a family feud with this whole sort of thing. And so here's what happens. From this messy political infighting in the imperial family emerges a fascinating character whose name is Julian. Now, he's called Julian the Apostate. Julian the Apostate, and of course, he was a very smart guy. He actually grew up under house arrest, right? He grew up under house arrest in one of these squabbles in the imperial family. So he's locked up in the house arrest. Now, I'm going to give you some advice. If you're going to get locked up in house arrest, all right, or in our case today, if you're locked up under quarantine, which is where we are, which really is kind of annoying after a while. Everyone wants to get out, no one wants to stay at home all day, and so on and so forth, even though it's probably a really good idea with this coronavirus thing. But we get enough sense. We all, I think, have a sense of what Julian was dealing with when he was put under house arrest. He's locked up. So let me give you some advice. If you're going to be locked up under house arrest, you need a library. Now, today our library can be the internet. You can get it on the phone if you want to, or you can use your smartphone for that sort of thing. But back in the olden days, you didn't have any of that. So Julian is locked up, he's under house arrest, and he has nothing to do except for the fact he's locked up in a place that happened to have a library. So what does he do? He spends a lot of time reading books, and he reads a lot of books. And he's a very smart guy, so this is fine. He enjoyed doing that, so he read all sorts of things, and he sort of became a, not expert on any one thing, but he got knowledgeable about a lot of things with this. And he's kind of an eccentric guy, and maybe because he was locked up, maybe he was just born that way. He's kind of an eccentric, funny fellow here. Now, history has looked back on Julian in a number of ways. He's called Julian the Apostate. Now, oftentimes the term apostate gets a lot of negative attention. People say, oh, apostates are bad. Here's what an apostate actually is. An apostate is someone who says, I don't want the old religion, the one that I had before. I'm either going to get a new one or I'm going to ditch religion altogether. That's all an apostate is. They're just someone who changes their religion. Now, the people in the old religion probably look at them and say, that's not a good thing. You shouldn't have abandoned your old faith. Your old faith is good. But the people in the new faith might say, hey, good idea, welcome to the club. So an apostate may or not be considered a bad thing. It kind of depends on your point of view. And so Julian takes a look around him, and he says to himself, gosh, I've read all this philosophy, I've read all this Greek and Roman philosophy, I've been reading all this interesting stuff, and I'm looking at the empire, and I'm looking at my own family. And my relatives are killing each other. They're sending armies out to kill each other so they can be the next emperor. They're fighting over the throne. They're fighting over the throne. And this is a mess. It's not a good thing at all. It's a lot of turmoil and trouble. And so Julian comes to the conclusion, he says, you know what I think the problem is? I think the problem is Christianity itself. I think the people who are fighting with each other are fighting because of Christianity. I think Christianity is messing up the Roman Empire. And that means we need to get rid of it. We need to get these Christians out of politics. We need to get the Christians out of positions of power. We need to make them poor. We need to take away their money. He's not a fan of Christianity. And it's probably because he saw his own family killing each other, oftentimes wrapping themselves in the mantle of Christianity as they did. All right, so we can kind of sympathize with him, all right? But on the other hand, I'm not sure you can blame a religion for political turmoil. That's not necessarily fair either. But anyway, so he's a pretty good scholar, a pretty sharp sort of guy, and he says Christianity is ruining the empire. Now, his three cousins are eliminating each other, right? There's this family feud, and like boom, 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 boom. They're all killing each other off, so they're eliminating each other. And so finally, Julian is sent off to Gaul, which is today France. He's sent off to Gaul, which is kind of a hick post, way out of the way. Let's get cousin Julian out of the way, out of the picture, and off he goes, and we won't have to worry about him anymore. He gets out there, and he's given a army, because he's supposed to defend the frontier. And turns out, old Julian happens to have a knack for being a general. He's actually a good military leader. He's a good tactician. He's good at strategy. He beats the Germans back. He pushes them into retreat. And his troops go, wow, this is great. This guy is cool. There's nothing that makes troops happier than winning generals. All right? Even if the generals are a little crazy or something like that, troops love winners. Just take a look how American troops looked at Patton. Patton was kind of a nut, but he was a great general, and his troops loved the guy, right? So this is something that we see with Julian. His troops say, this guy's a really good general. We got a lot of loot. We're winning battles. This is great. They say, we like this guy. He's cool. And then his troops say, maybe he ought to be the emperor. Maybe he should be the emperor. And so what happens is Julian's army says, hey, boss, let's go and make you the emperor. And Julian says, well, okay. So off they go, and they march off to Constantinople and their army, and Constantius, one of his relatives here, has a bigger army, and he comes out, and Constantius comes out with his bigger army, and they're going to have a big battle, and then Constantius makes a terrible, horrible, awful mistake you must never, ever, ever make if you want to be Roman emperor. And that is, yes, Constantius drops dead. Who knows how history might have gone if he hadn't, but Constantius keels over, and he's gone. He's DED dead. Okay? So Constantius is out of the picture. So Constantius' army's like, well, the boss is dead. There's another guy over here. He's got an army. We'll join him. So Julian becomes the emperor, right? He's a pagan. All right? He has abandoned Christianity. He has said, I don't like Christianity. This is no good. And now he says, I have power. I have the power. And here's what I'm going to do with my power. I'm going to shut down these Christians because I think they're messing up the empire. I'm not okay with what they're doing. And he sets out to weaken Christianity, to weaken the church, which is why, in hindsight, Christians have always looked back on Julian as being a bad guy. But he sets out to weaken the church. And here's what he says. Look, I know perfectly well, he's a smart guy, I know perfectly well the problem. Paganism is not an effective competition for Christianity. It's not competing effectively with Christianity. And you can look at religions as being in competition in this way. And so he says, here's the problem. We need to come up with pagan institutions that can challenge and compete with Christian institutions. One of the big reasons Christianity was successful in the Roman Empire was precisely this. They had institutions. And the institutions were extremely successful. They did things that needed to be done. And institutions are not tied to any individual. One individual dies, the institution can go on. Think about the way corporations work today. The founder of a corporation can be long dead, the corporation keeps going. Institutions have staying power. They have staying power. And so the church has staying power, so he says, hey, Julian says, we need a pagan church to compete with the Christians, and he sets out to build this. He sets out to literally build a pagan version of Christianity in a way without Christianity in it, to compete with Christianity. And he writes books. He's very energetic about this. He wrote a book called Against the Galilean. Of course, Jesus came from Galilee, right? So, Against the Galilean. Unfortunately, here's the problem. Julian is a very smart guy, but he's not a specialist at any one thing. He's very good at a lot of things, but he's not a specialist. And so when he tries to get into philosophy and religious discussions, he runs into people who are specialists in this, and they're really good at this. And so it's kind of an amateurish piece of work, and a lot of scholars are like, this isn't that good. Which means they don't really get on board, right? It really wasn't an effective attack on Christianity. It was not a very good attack on Christianity. And the fact is the church by this time had some very smart people working for it who become really good at debunking what our friend Julian is trying to do, all right? Is what trying to do. But he keeps trying. He reinstitutes pagan sacrifices, for example. He says, we're going to clear the Jewish temple site in Jerusalem. We're going to build a temple there. Now, this was probably a really bad idea here. Probably a really bad idea because the Jews were not cool about this. The temple site was still sacred. It was a ruin by this time. It was totally trashed because, of course, the rebellions of the Jews had been put down by the Romans, but it's still a sacred site here. And it gets started, and then there's an earthquake, and, well, let's face it, you can read the tea leaves. Like, okay, obviously we shouldn't do this, right? Some people said, a lot of people said, okay, well, maybe we'll leave the Jewish God alone. So it didn't really go anywhere. So he says, we need to create an organized pagan priesthood. And he sets out to try and do this. But, again, he's pushing against a huge institution by this time. And he's really, really having problems. And it's not going the way he wanted. Because again, one of the most important things to understand about religions is you can't just force religion on people. You cannot just say, we're all going to pick one, whatever. All right? The religion's got to sell itself. The religion's got to give people something they need. If a religion does not give people what they need, the religion is not going to make it. It's not going to survive. All right? Religions serve people. That's why they exist, that's what they're good at, and that's what they're for. And Julian is trying to impose an old pagan religion with new clothes. And it's not going that well. So he's getting frustrated, right? He's getting frustrated. And so by 362 AD, he's getting very, very frustrated. His ideas are not taking hold. And so he says, okay, what we need to do is come up with some really splashy thing to show how powerful we are. And he decides to attack the Sasanian Persian Empire, Rome's big rival to the east. Now, the Sasanians we've talked about, they were tough characters. They were powerful, they were very dangerous, and they gave the Romans as good as they got. And at this time in their history, they happen to have an extremely powerful, extremely dynamic king. We've already met him. His name was Shapur II. And he got a star, you'll remember. He showed up with a star in our PDF here as well. Shapur II was nobody to mess with. He was a very, very smart guy, and he has a very powerful empire behind him. So old Julian invades here. And old Julian invades. So what happens is, well, he attacks. All right, he's going to go after Shapur and the Sasanian Persian Empire. He figures we win a nice big war over there against our big rival, then things will start going better. All right, and so Julian arrives and he's going after this, and along the way he stops at the Temple of Apollo, and he says, this is going to be great. We'll stop at a nice pagan temple. It'll be a nice message. They don't have cameras, so you can't call it a photo op, but you get the idea. So old Julian arrives, and he realizes the temple's pretty much empty, which is kind of scary because it means his reforms, his attempt to create paganism or recreate paganism isn't working here. It's not really working. So he marches in, and he gets into Mesopotamia. And here's what Shapur did. Now, Shapur's clever. Shapur simply withdrew. Shapur pulled back. In comes the Roman army. In comes Julian with his army. And Julian is a very good general, so he's nobody to mess with. And Shapur just keeps retreating. He keeps on retreating, and he retreats. And so finally, Julian gets to Ctesiphon, the capital. All right, the capital for the Sasanians. He besieges it, but he doesn't get in. He can't get in. He's unable to break in, and eventually his supply lines start getting too long, and he says, we got to pull back. We've got to pull back here. And as he's pulling back, as Julian is retreating, he made a terrible, horrible, awful mistake you must never, ever, ever, ever make if you want to defeat the Sasanian Empire, much less push Christianity out of Rome, which is Julian is killed. Okay, he is killed. His successor, the next emperor, has to basically make nice with Shapur. Shapur kicks their butt. He basically kicks their butt. And here's the thing. After Julian, every single Roman emperor, every single one, is going to be a Christian. Now, here's what we're going to talk about next. What does that mean? What is a Christian? Because this is something Constantine had never anticipated. This was something that he never had, because Constantine, remember, he was a political player. And when political players decide we're going to make a religion our main focus, we're going to make religion the main thing we're going to do, political players, it never goes the way they want. Because political players know how to play politics and not religion. But here's the problem. The Roman Empire is becoming increasingly Christian. But what is Christianity? What is this thing we call Christianity? It's real easy to just stick up a name. This is Christianity. See, right here, there it is. Okay, that's Christianity. No, Christianity is just a word. What is Christianity? It's a belief system, and it's complicated. And so the real problem the Romans are going to have now is they need to figure out not just are we going to be Christian, but what the heck is Christianity anyway? And there is not agreement about that among Christians themselves. There are, in fact, extremely serious disagreements about what is Christianity. There are serious disagreements about who and what was Christ. And if you don't have that figured out, your Christianity is going to have a really tough time spreading around. So the Romans are in this tight bind. They're trying to make Christianity the main thing, and it's going to be the main thing from this point on. Julian is the last gasp of paganism in terms of politics. But what are they going to do? How are the Romans going to make this work? Because they need to understand, they need to have a Christianity, not a whole bunch of Christianities. that argue with each other, but one Christianity. And the guy who's going to really try to make this happen also gets 2 stars, and he's our good friend Theodosius. And he is where we're going to pick up our discussion in our next section.